Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Mona. First, I guess the first thing to say is on the ground in the Creative City, it's taking the Creative City from the point of view of a practitioner, someone who's been in Toronto, working in Toronto for more than 30 years, living in Toronto for more than 30 years, and giving you a very subjective, personal, unscientific overview of my direct experience of the city as it's grown and in its current state. But I think as a first statement, I want to say something about our practice in the city of Toronto. For at least the last 15 years, scientists, artists, administrators, clients of all kinds have said to us, break down silos, allow the free flow of creativity between disciplines, allow cross-pollination of ideas. We're relying on you to help us find new ways to do better research. Imagine that being the program that a client gives to you, not so many square meters, not such a relationship to the context, but actually being an integral part of their success as creators in the creative city. That is their program. So we've been exploring through our concepts, through our planning, and our forms, ways to accomplish this. In my opinion, the next generation of city making will rely on durable ways to encourage collaboration and thoughtful work, to encourage places that allow the more free flow of ideas, but not through novelty or spectacle, but instead through understanding of human nature, building edges, and social interaction. So while our realm as architects, planners, and designers is inevitably symbolic and can be abstracted, I'm interested in those inventions that are not mere symbols of interaction, but rather calibrated, carefully orchestrated, real mechanisms of social engagement. A deliberate set of literal relationships where the edge between interiors and the public realm is an experiential one. It's an explicit and productive one, not an abstraction. So I ask you to think about that as I take you through a brief history of Toronto. And I ask you to think about that when you look at some projects that may seem familiar to you, because you may have seen them before, but I want you to think about them through that lens, through the lens of very specific devices to fulfill the wishes of our clients, the scientists, artists, and administrators. These next few slides, I would like you to think about hypergrowth. We don't tend to think of 1880 to 1905 as a period of hypergrowth, but it was a very significant period in the history of Toronto. Most of the residential downtown area was constructed during that period of time, 1880 to 1905. Hypergrowth. And you can see that it was a very durable fabric that was constructed. You can see on the screen the very typical format of it, single-family homes, gardens, and trees, and a nearby park. There was a second, in my opinion, very significant period of hypergrowth, and that was probably 1955 to 1975, post-war, meeting the urgent needs of post-war housing, the growth of the middle class, great influx of immigration, and new building types were being explored between 1955 and 1975, call it 20 years. And we had a very interesting experience with those building types because we discovered, after they'd been constructed, while they were being occupied, that we hadn't quite figured out how to properly manage the relationship at grade between these buildings and their adjacent landscape, their neighbors, and the streets. So a very interesting thing happened to that building type is that in 1975, City Council banned towers. Banned towers for a 20-year period. Imagine that. Not all over the city, but in the downtown core, until we could manage these relationships a little bit better. What emerged then in that next 20-year period between 1975 and 1995 or so was the exploration of the superblock. The superblock was a way to achieve density, urban fabric, without it requiring a tall building. This was also a period of time, 20 years, where every student in a school of architecture like you are in now was being asked to understand the detailed relationships of the public, semi-public, semi-private, and private spaces between every sidewalk and every front door, so that we would never make those same mistakes again as we made between 1955 and 1975. A number of buildings were constructed during that time. Some of them are very successful and continue to be successful today. When the ban was lifted in 1996, it happened to, by chance, coincide with a significant change in the economy. The economy in 1991 was in severe recession. By 1996, we were emerging out of the recession. The ban was lifted by our mayor, Barbara Hall, and the building type that was being studied at the time, other places in the world, but very specifically in Vancouver, was this tower and podium type that managed urban space, wind, and density. So our period of growth, this next hyper-growth period, 1996 to where we are today, coincided with the development of this building type. I want you to look at this chart because it shows you some accuracy and some inaccuracy. It doesn't represent, I believe, 1880 to 1905 very well because it's talking about towers, not about occupants or buildings. However, and also remember that in 1955 to 1975, the towers were about 12 to 15,000 square foot floor plates and maxed out at about 30 stories, often around 20. So the comparison here is floors of towers, but not necessarily numbers of units. Nevertheless, there's no mistaking what's going on. And if you read the paper this morning, the Globe and Mail this morning, on tower construction, it indicated that the number of units completed in January of 2015 was 10,000 units. 10,000 units. And that we're projecting to be 24,000 units, or 27,000 units in the period between 2014 and 2015. Growth is not slowing. So how can growth, with all of the naysayers that you read, all of the concern about this building type, how can growth be not slowing? And there are lots of explanations in the paper, which I'll leave you to read. But I also want to give you a glimpse of what that means on the ground. This is the Toronto waterfront in 1998, and this is it in 2012. That's 14 years. Have a look on the left side of the screen in particular. That's Liberty Village. That's the waterfront. So that's what's going on, and these are now 30, 40, and 50-story towers, and that's in 14 years. Here's another one at the waterfront, 1988 to 2012. Again, have a look on the left side of the screen, the center of the screen. It's everywhere. And from the air, railway lands, 2002 to 2012, again on the left side of the screen. Significant growth, coincident with a building type and a construction technique. So as you can imagine, having policies that might manage this growth, recognizing our history, looking forward to a vibrant new city, the new creative city, two important documents, which I'm sure you're aware of. I not too jokingly ask all of the people in my office to have a copy at the office, a copy in their favorite reading space at home, and maybe under their pillow. We need to understand what is contained in this document, the Tall Buildings Guidelines, but I think most importantly, because it extends far beyond the city core. Look at the difference between the city core and the rest of the city. It is the mid-rise and avenues guidelines that is really going to transform the city. It's adding density along these great avenues, and I think the document itself, the mid-rise and avenues guidelines, should be required reading because of the way it documents the history of Toronto and what's been learned from that period of growth from 55 to 75, which we had to learn to correct. Now, you can't say creative city without mentioning this person's name. And it's been interesting to reflect on the period of time. Again, we're talking about a coincidence of the notion of the creative city occurring in the early 2000s, of lots of documentation occurring when Toronto was in a beginning period, and some would argue we're still in a beginning period of significant growth. And what is going on here, what's being suggested is that culture, creativity, and innovation are a powerful economic force. Now, we would have said manufacturing was a powerful economic force. Or, well, we would have said that for a good long time, wouldn't we? Manufacturing is a powerful economic force. Finance is a secondary economic force. But culture, creativity, and innovation, and it was made clear by all the symposia taking place in the early 2000s that if you have a city which supports these three things, you have the foundations of future growth. Not only that, that this idea of a creative city led to being able to quantify whether you were or weren't a creative city. Look at Toronto out there, above Detroit and under Seattle in 2006. Well, what does that mean? Each definition, specific definition of the creative city was probably closer to the author than it was to an absolute truth, but all to say that it's being quantified. In the city of Toronto, 2003, there was a culture plan. What's going on? It's an understanding that for us to go forward in this new understanding of the future city, the future creative city, we have to support culture, and we have to know how to quantify or evaluate whether we've properly supported culture. So those of you who know Toronto from some time ago know that we identified with being a low-scale city. And really, the towers were the anomaly. The downtown right now has transformed completely, depending on what level you're looking at it from. And so how did this happen? How does it happen that we go from being delighted with being a low-scale city to being a much more successful, high-density, hyper-growth city? How does that happen? And this is a question you could ask yourself. Outsiders to the city would say, how can you live in these tiny apartments, in those tall glass towers? How can you live there? And the truth is that you, except for, I think, about a 12-month period, you cannot build them fast enough. People are choosing and voting with their mortgages to be part of this intense creative city. It's dramatic, and it doesn't stop being dramatic. And again, the news this morning reinforces that. One of the things that happened in that 20-year period between 1975 and 1995 is that industry left downtown Toronto. It was a mass exodus of manufacturing, interestingly coincident with that period. Well, there's a mass influx now of industries that were previously out in the suburbs coming into the creative city. Apple, Google, E1, others are coming into the city because of the attraction of the city. And again, in that same period, 96 to 2015, I'm going to leave this on the screen for a minute. These are the number of cultural projects, cultural milestones in the city that have been constructed in the last short while. And you could ask yourself, well, if those were only constructed in the last 20 years or 15 years, what was here before that? And the answer was earlier versions of the AGO and the ROM and the Science Center and the Sky Dome and the CN Tower. So we have really created the infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure of the city during this hypergrowth period. Well, how do you do that? You do that because with hypergrowth comes immense wealth creation, and with immense wealth creation, with the great example of our neighbor to the south, can come philanthropy. And we didn't have a real culture of philanthropy nearly to the extent that we have now in Toronto. And when you have that intersection of wealth creation, philanthropy, and this critical mass of innovators and creators, then suddenly quite extraordinary things start to happen that wouldn't have been conceived in the city of Toronto before. So you've got cultural infrastructure. What else? Recent, really significant indicators are saying that in this period of hypergrowth, which if you're on the outside of it, you could wonder how can it be sustained? What's it like to live there? Suddenly we get these 4 interesting indicators. Number one, 3 out of 4 people in this catchment area do not use a car. If you were thinking about a future city that was car-free, it's happening already in downtown Toronto in a very large area. Interesting. It was maybe on its way, but suddenly in this period of hypergrowth, it's been reinforced. You've got density, you've got proximity, don't need a car. Wow, that's unusual. This is one that surprised me the most. The Youthful Cities Index did a remarkable survey across the entire world, and they discovered that to be able to start a career, you needed to go to a city where you had opportunity and some of the basics in the beginning of your career were at a low cost. You'll never guess who the top 2 cities of the world in the world were for youth affordability: Paris and Toronto. How is that possible? I'm not going to fight it, but those of us who studied in Toronto and live in Toronto know that it can be that way, but you wouldn't think with all the news that it still could be true. This is a recent survey. Next, The Economist. The Economist does an evaluation of 50 major cities in the world for safety, livability, cost of living, business environment, democracy, food security. Those are important things when you're choosing where to live, where to set up a business, where to have a family. Top city in the world by an independent research group. Right. So suddenly, it would seem to me that the reason for the unstoppability of hypergrowth in downtown is not based on novelty, it's not based on spectacle, it's actually based on an incredibly powerful foundation of healthy city growth. Another aspect of healthy city growth is deeply diversified economy. A deeply diversified economy is one where you can start imagining things that you might think might only happen somewhere else in the world, but they can actually happen here in Toronto. And we had an opportunity with a couple of colleagues from the office to answer a call for a public art commission in downtown Toronto a couple of years ago. And the call came out in January, and it got decided in February and March. And finally, in the space of a couple of months, we were left with finding 1,500 feet of ribbon, of spandex, 10 feet high, the same number of rental scaffolding, same amount of rental scaffolding, step motors, windsocks, and it was all able to be done by gifts in kind, by a little bit of philanthropy, by a little bit of research, and suddenly we were able to reshape an urban space, of actually a very bad urban space in downtown Toronto, and we were able to give a glimpse of what can happen with a little bit of imagination in a temporary way in David Pico Square in downtown Toronto. So Marcin and Bradley from my office led this project. We're able to do some diagrams to be able to put it all together. Went up to a warehouse site just a little bit north of Toronto, had a mock-up done, had it tested to failure, so we stretched the spandex over these frames, soaked them, and then had a giant fan blown at them. Like, where do you find a fan big enough to tear the wet spandex? We found one. And so then we were able to get someone who was a master tailor who was able to find a way to do a new stitching detail so that the tension was able to be applied, and with the wet fabric and the better stitching, it was all able to come together. And if you permit me, and I don't know if I can do this, yes I can, I'm going to let you hear it from Bradley and Marcin themselves.
Windscape is Diamond & Schmidt's 2012 proposal for the Luminato Festival Hub. We wanted to make a inviting and interactive space. We decided to use wind as a medium that helped facilitate change in the square.
It's a piece that not only embodies the wind as a concept that we tried to use, but also sort of grabs the square and creates a sense of space for the artist, for the public, and for the interaction between the two.
We said basically create the feeling of a space, of something that would envelop the city, and have it be artistic, almost be an artwork in its own right. And Diamond & Schmitt really were up to the task and created a fantastic proposal.
There's two main components to Windscape. One is the almost 700-foot by 20-foot spandex blue ribbon. The second component is the 9 robotic windsocks, which are behind me. Windsocks being ambassadors of wind. These ones here are computer-controlled and choreographed to music.
When you get into this world of sort of allowing them to be the dancers, perform in front of you, so you forget that they're mechanical in a sense, and you begin to look at them more as performers rather than just a windsock. After dark is really when the windsocks shine. I think by adding the aspect of light to the windsocks, they really take.
So who you saw, Bradley and Marcin, recent graduates in the office for a couple of years, looking for public art projects, and Janice Price, there's the philanthropy, right? And it's when the creators and the philanthropy come together, unexpected temporary things can happen that completely transform and allow us to reimagine the public spaces. So the diversity of the creative city, the economic diversity, allows this and much, much more, of course, to happen. It's just a taste of what is possible. I want to talk now a little bit about the premise that I enunciated at the beginning, which is about edges and mechanisms. I want to show you a few projects now where we have made a very explicit point of how we develop the edges of a project and its interaction with the public realm. In some cases, it's quite straightforward. In other cases, it's literally a device within the buildings themselves. You're probably familiar with these buildings, but I'm going to ask you to look at them slightly differently now, understanding them not to be a display, but actually to be a mechanism of exchange on the edge of the public realm. This is a very familiar image to many of you. This is the Four Seasons Opera House, and it is a glass box on the edge of University Avenue. But it's not just a glass box. It is low iron glass, which makes it perfectly clear, and it has low reflectivity, so that you are allowed to see into it, but you're also allowed to see out of it extremely well. And look at the posture of all the people sitting in that very formal arrangement, not facing away from, but adjacent to this glass wall, visible to the street, and they too can see the activity on the street. This is a mechanism for engagement between audience and city. Based on that and the success of that, the Four Seasons Opera House still maintains about a 95% occupancy, about 7 years after construction, really unusual. For it to be that successful. We think we have a part to play in that, apart from their programming. National Arts Centre said, you know what, we've got these concrete walls facing the city in Ottawa. Can you help? and we developed a master plan which was a mechanism for engagement between the audience and the city. Again, it's not a display, it's actually a very carefully calibrated set of relationships that we're trying to organize. Look at the title of this building that we're doing at Laurier University, Global Innovation Exchange. Right? It's all about the free flow of creativity among professionals in a building, and this is a building whose sole purpose is that. Forms, okay, interesting, but the edges, ensuring if you don't have the edges to go along with those forms, then the building will not make a contribution. It'll be a mute building in the landscape, and the urban space will not evolve. We're working in St. Catharines right now. We're doing, this is a project that I'm working on, School of Art in the City of St. Catharines. Art gallery, student interaction, collaboration space that doubles as lobby, big porch, covered porch, and entrance. Those are not accidents. Those are deliberate layers meant to allow all those lines to be blurred and for them all to become an art gallery, or for it all to be theatrical space, or for it all to be student collaboration space. Those edges, even in this environment, which isn't strictly a strongly urban environment, there's that same space right down there. There's the porch, the collaboration space, and the art gallery behind. At a slightly larger scale, and I think, in my opinion, even more interesting, is this project that I worked on at the beginning of the hypergrowth period, the Bahen Center for Information Technology. The clients came to us and said, we have 17 disparate departments. Can you bring these departments together? We want to stimulate innovation. We see that our future creativity in electrical engineering is based on the cross-fertilization of ideas. Not one person having a genius idea, but people talking about it from different departments where iPhone apps designers are talking to Wi-Fi signal designers and encryption designers. It's that kind of collaboration that leads to innovation. So what we did in the center of this block, so that's St. George Street in Toronto and College Street at the bottom, in the center you'll see this drum. And those are all the labs. These are the offices. There are labs and offices of various different scales. But in the middle of the entire plan, we created this very elaborated landing. It's actually a 9-story high landing. 6 of the floors have these meeting rooms in it. It's got a stair wrapped around it. And the purpose of this was to have people interact informally and formally at the center of the plan. Not an abstraction, really, that you had to go there to use the shared meeting rooms. So it was a source of efficiency, but it was also a source of collaboration and interaction. This is what it looked like in our diagrams when we were analyzing it. And imagine, again, think of the program that the client gave us, increase the possibility of new discoveries by bringing people together. There are many, many different things that we did in this building, but this is a one vertical device that was the focus of all those. And this is what it looks like on the interior. So it's a stair in light with elaborated landings, with all kinds of opportunities for pause and for collision between two people, but also the meeting rooms themselves. It's a device with the sole purpose of encouraging the cross-pollination of ideas. I want to talk about this building now in Ottawa that I finished a couple of years ago. We were asked to encourage collaborative learning. It was a fierce project, incredibly short schedule, very difficult circumstances, competition, and we took a chance. We thought, you know what, we're going to devote 7–8% of the area to collaborative learning spaces. We're going to give all sorts of opportunities, different postures, different kinds of seating areas, and we'll see whether this connects with the client. It really did connect with the client. They loved the project. You can see this is this 2-story lobby space, but it's an occupied lobby space. These things are seating areas where you can sit in a group, you can sit at a large table, you can sit facing away, you can sit facing in, and we discovered that these different postures, these different configurations actually have been incredibly successful, at encouraging collaborative learning, but also at encouraging attraction and retention. They're now talking about an addition to this building because it's been so successful. So you can see these devices whose sole purpose is collaborative learning. One last one that I wanted to show you. Again, the client said to us, it's a very big, very important client. We're doing more work for them in redesigning, remaster planning the actual sick children's hospital. They said, break down silos, encourage the cross-pollination of ideas. Our future success is reliant on it. It doesn't matter that we're bringing 2,000 researchers to this building in a 20-story building together if they cannot work together in new ways. So this device you see on the exterior building is not just a decoration. It is the key piece of the building. Like many other great lab designers in North America, we can deliver a lab building to them, no problem. And we give them great offices, and we can give them efficiency and effectiveness. But what we also saw was the possibility to give them this space where you can occupy the edge of this as well as the main floor of it, that we can do it in clusters, 3 stories high, so that's 300 people, 100 people a floor, 300 people sharing this commons, and in doing so, start to cross-pollinate between molecular therapy, brain and behavior, organs and system diseases, and look to the future of research in sick children. We also took the liberty of color-coding the exterior of the building in layers to represent these groups. But most importantly was that the form of the building was entirely reliant on developing an architectural device with the sole purpose of encouraging cross-pollination of ideas and continuing to build a momentum of creativity in the creative city. Thank you.